So welcome to this webinar, which is all about digital analytics in 2020 and the use of big data to get some best practice into your organization around the whole subject of using numbers and analytics and insights that you can basically get from a whole range of different sources, and we'll explore some of those as we go through this session. If you're live on the session right here, right now, then you can use the chat facility to ask any questions at all as we go through the session, and we'll do a Q&A at the end of it, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that you have. If you're watching this on catch up, use the message thread facility underneath this particular recording, and you'll be able to ask any questions, and again I'll endeavour to answer those as we go through. One of the things that we need to really be thinking about as we focus on the whole subject of data and analytics is really what matters and why you should be interested in the whole subject of analytics. Well, if you blindly go through your day-to-day activities in your organization, communicating both internally and externally, you could be missing a lot of opportunities to claim a really good use of the resources, the time and the energy and the money that you spend. So one of the key reasons why analytics really matters is that it allows you to save time and save budget. In other words, actually spend your time really appropriately, because if you can understand what is going on and right down to a really granular level of detail, if you can really understand what's going on, then you can start to listen and learn about the things that work and do more of them, and the things that aren't working, either change them or stop doing them. So it's really quite a simple kind of mantra to get into, and understanding that this is all about creating efficiency and creating best practice in your organization. Analytics also matters because it allows you to see and glean opportunities from the patterns and trends, and that's a really important word, the word trend. The patterns and trends that you see as you look at the performance of the activities that you do. And this can be tactical activities, so it could be things like social media, improvements to your website and the like, or it could be much bigger strategic things like really key campaigns that you do, maybe a rebrand, and those kinds of sort of higher level, longer term activities. So it allows you to search and look for opportunities in those activities, as well as looking for trends, not only within the organization and the kinds of things that you get up to yourself, but also in the world around you. And that's something that we'll cover as we look through this. And another key thing in terms of why analytics matters to you and really should matter to you is that your organization wants evidence. Okay, this is one of the things that is so important in marketing. It's very easy to do stuff, and I really like that word stuff, because a lot of us in marketing do stuff. We do a lot of stuff. In other words, kind of random activities, things that we feel are going to be beneficial, but actually at the end of the day, we're not really quite sure what has worked and what hasn't worked. So we continue to do stuff. So what we're really after here are pockets of evidence to the things that have really made a difference, the things that maybe we could have improved upon, so that we can continuously learn. So a big benefit of using analytics in this way is that we can continuously learn and improve, because the organization wants to understand how to get best efficiencies, and it wants to do that based on evidence. So no longer is it any good to say, yeah, I spent some budget, yeah, I did some things, but actually I'm not sure quite what those things benefited us by or how they did. The organization now wants you to be able to say, I'm comparing A versus B. I'm looking at what we did before with what we're doing now and what we could do in the future. So I want to see evidence of everything that we do so that we can continuously learn. So that's really important. Another set of reasons as to kind of why analytics matters is because the organization, and probably you yourself, are really keen to understand how you can get best return on investment, ROI. It's one of those key phrases that we hear so often, but that few people really get into the heart of. Now, the best way of using analytics from an ROI perspective, in other words, using data, numbers, and insights to show evidence of return on investment, is to actually reverse engineer backwards from the endpoint that you desire. In other words, if you have a target or an objective, you have a particular goal, and that goal is going to be very beneficial for your organization. The idea is to really understand what that goal means and get really to the heart of that goal, that target. So set a really smart objective for an ROI, a return on investment of your time, energy, and budget. Look at that end goal, look at that end point and think, right, okay, that is what I'm going to become obsessed by. Now, how am I going to get to that point of return on investment? It could be a financial number. It could be a physical number of connections or customers. It could be something a little bit softer, like the quality of engagements that you have or the quality of the customer satisfaction. So it can be an objective ROI, or it could be a subjective ROI, or a balance between the two. But you've got to get really to the heart of that. Because the best way of starting this analytics journey is to focus on that return on investment point. In other words, as a result of doing all of this marketing activity, where am I trying to get to? So what I can do is I can now sit at that point, turn around and look backwards towards all of the things that I need to do to get me to this point. So I reverse engineer backwards. In other words, I work backwards to where I am right now, and then start to begin with actually what I need to know and learn today to get me to that future point. So it is like a route map. It is a process. So if you can map out that process, which of course is going to include steps, in other words, there could be a whole bunch of things that you don't actually know the answer to right now, but to get to this desired ROI, you're going to need to know those things. There could also be a number of big gaps, really, in terms of the things that you measure, maybe gaps in terms of activities that you're planning to do. And of course, all of these unknowns, if you can plot them out, then at least then you stand a chance of taking those steps to get you to that desired point in the future. So by reverse engineering from that desired point of ROI in the future, that defined point in time, you know where you're headed. So you know where this route map's going to take you. And by then turning around and looking backwards, you can begin to figure out the things that you need to know and the things that you're going to have to learn and the gaps that are already in place to get you to that point. So it is quite a strategic process. It is quite a logical kind of process-driven thing to be doing. This is not all about, hey, look at my lovely statistics. Hey, look at all these lovely visitors I've got to my website. You know, that is part of it, but it's not at the core of what you're trying to do here. So analytics really matters because it's focused on ultimate ROI that you're trying to aim for. Now, of course, when we start to think about this and start to put in place in this process some of those building blocks to get us to that point of ROI, we instantly start thinking about the customers who we're going to be communicating with. Now, a lot of the time when we think about customers, we're thinking about, as marketers and as communicators, we're thinking about the journey we're trying to take our customers along. Now, the fortunate thing, as we'll see in a moment, is that a lot of the insight platforms, a lot of the analytics platforms now are also following that same journey. So what they're doing is they are now presenting information in terms of sales funnels, in terms of visitor flow, in terms of behavioral flow, and you'll see these key phrases popping up on some of these platforms and in some of this software, because the providers of these platforms know that marketers are now becoming really passionate about customer journeys, the journeys they're taking their customers along. So what they're doing is they're presenting the analytics back in the terms and in the language that marketers can understand and can actively and proactively use. So when we start to think about these endpoints of this desired ROI and where we're trying to actually get to, what we need to be thinking then is aligning those process points and those campaigns and those activities with our customer journey. And analytics also matters in terms of the different types of fuel that we're going to be putting into those customer journeys in the terms of content. So most people think of, when they're sort of thinking about analytics, they instantly think about their website and they instantly think about optimizing their website and getting it as efficient as possible in terms of the words that are said. And that goes back sort of a couple of decades now in terms of search engine optimization. And that's really where this whole kind of data and information and insight analytics began. It was back in the days of, really effectively optimizing your website. Not even thinking about journeys, but just actually optimizing each web page in terms of words. Now, as we know, as we sit here listening and watching and thinking about this today, is that content comes in all forms and guises. So we must remember when we're thinking about analytics and insights, not only thinking about words, but also images, also video, and certainly this new kid on the block is this huge growth in podcast attractiveness sort of increases into 2020 and beyond. The use of audio as well. So analytics and the measurement along these customer journeys of all of this different types of content has got to be at the forefront of our minds. So when we think of analytics and insights, we've got to be thinking words, images, video, and audio. And we've also got to be thinking the whole length of our customer journey. So what we need to avoid, and you probably have heard this phrase, vanity metrics, that's a key thing we need to be avoiding in this journey as we sort of explore all the different analytics that we have available to us. We must not start from the point of vanity metrics. Vanity metrics are the kinds of things like how many followers do I have? How many visitors came to my website? These were things that 10, 15, 20 years ago were really quite exciting because we didn't have at our disposal all of the different forms of analytics that we have here today. So they became ways of creating really quite bad habits. Vanity metrics were those kinds of numbers and that kind of data that made you as a marketer feel quite comfortable in the work that you were doing because, it was actually quite straightforward to drag people kicking and screaming to your website. So, hey, I've achieved that, so I've done a good job as a marketer. But of course, we know we haven't because there's no quality in that, that's just quantity. And the same goes for, Twitter followers, Instagram followers, Facebook followers, LinkedIn followers, anybody really, and it is quite easy to do because you can buy followers and you can buy, these kind of numbers of connections. And there are services that are out there allowing you to do that. But that is not what we're talking about here. That is vanity metrics. That is kind of the lazy marketer's way of doing things. What we're talking about here is analytics and measurement of things that really matter. In other words, the number of people who traveled the extent of that visitor or customer journey that we have plotted, the number of people who got through to that point of conversion and became a customer. How did they do it? What content did they consume en route? What did they like about the experience? What did they not like about the experience? When did we encounter them at the most efficient and appropriate times? And what kinds of content did they consume? Those are the things that really matter because those are the things that can allow us to continuously improve. The number of followers that we got does not inspire continuous improvement. I mean, what does that actually really tell you? It tells you quantity, but it doesn't tell you quality. So we've got some challenges to play with here. So what kind of stuff can you measure? So if we take it that, when we talk about analytics and we talk about big data and we talk about measurement, what kinds of things can you measure? Well, as you probably already know, I like things in threes because 3 to me is this magic number. So for me in digital analytics, we have got 3 kind of levels of, if you like, of things that we can measure. We've got close stuff, we've got near stuff, and we've got far stuff. So we've got stuff that really is very, very close to us, things that we can control. We've also got near stuff. So that's stuff in the world around us that, we can influence. And if we do have some influence over it, then there's kind of a knock-on effect. So things that we can do within our sort of control and our circle of influence. And then there's kind of far stuff. So stuff that ultimately will impact on us as an organization or as a business, but that we can't really affect. And so we need to kind of understand what do we mean by these 3 levels. So the first area of things that we can start to look at in terms of measurement is the really close stuff. Now, often when we think of close stuff, we think of some of the marketing tools that really are under our sort of ultimate control. So let's use as an example here our website. So in our website, we can control the measurement of things that we do. And I would call these real things that are very, very close to us. So we can control the amount of reach that our website has by the activity that we do. We can control the engagement, in other words, the interactivity, the conversations, if you like, the amount of time that is spent consuming the content that we create and actually put out on our website. So this is kind of really close stuff that's under our control. And also the comments, so the kind of the sentiment, if you like, of the interactivity. It's not sort of good enough any longer to just say, hey, I got 20 comments on that particular article on my blog. What you want to know is the sentiment of those comments. Were they positive? Were they neutral? Or were they negative? And kind of how did you react to those? And what does that mean going forward? This is the kind of level of interaction with your analytics that you need to be thinking about. So we're not looking at that kind of scratching the surface top level stuff. We're looking at a level that really kind of means something because it allows us to do something differently next time. So that very first level of measuring close stuff is obviously really important because we do have the control over what we put out and actually a lot of the interaction there within things like our website because it's under our jurisdiction. We can also measure the kind of near stuff. Now, I would sort of call this in probably slightly more technical terms, the micro environment. And particularly sort of from a digital perspective, this is the kind of stuff that will have an impact in terms of the activity that we do, but that is also being impacted by others outside of our organization. So the kinds of things that we're looking at here would be competitor activity. So we need to make sure that when we look at our digital analytics, that we're actually, monitoring competitor activity, and I can share some stuff with you in terms of tools that are available for you to do that. We're also needing to be monitoring, and this applies obviously in things like social media, some of the topics and some of the themes that are really, really importantly happening right here, right now. So this is about listening, this is about watching, this is about tracking trending topics, for example. So if you're using things like Instagram or Twitter, there are facilities for tracking those kind of hashtags so that you can see those trending topics. And this becomes particularly important if your end game, if the ROI that you're looking for at the end game relates to thought leadership on a particular subject. You're going to want to know who else is talking about that subject. What are they saying? What kind of sentiment is happening with their conversations and the kinds of interactivity that they're getting and reactions that they're getting. And of course, how your work and your activity in social media is also playing out in that space as well. So looking for trends in those kind of topics and those kinds of areas is really important. Now, the word trends in this kind of micro environment, in other words, your social sphere, if you like, your social sphere of influence, looking for trends in that area is really, really important. And, you need to be sort of watching how people are consuming the information, either through your organization or through your competitors, or also, really importantly, in this kind of social sphere, the influencers. So this could be your industry association. This could be the journalists or editors, the people who are talking a lot in your organization's sector about the kinds of sort of topics that, you would be engaging with as well. And influencers obviously come from a sort of a social perspective. So these could be influential customers, the ones who speak a lot. They could be anywhere really in your supply chain. So it's about figuring out who these people are, how they're impacting on the conversations that are happening within the environment that you're playing out, and spotting those trends. Little spikes of activity are probably interesting, but they're probably not going to allow you to then adapt your behavior in the medium to longer term. So when we're measuring this kind of micro environment, this micro near stuff, what we need to be thinking about is, do we see a pattern? Do we see a trend? In other words, can I spot something and then track it over the coming months so that I can actually show the evidence that actually this is something now worth investing time and energy in? Or was it just a flavor of the day? Was it just something that happened at that point? Because those two things are really, really fundamentally important to understand. What you're looking for are trends, things that are going to be sustainable, things that are worth you investing your time in, so that you can be very confident that this is about creating efficiency when you do spend a little bit of time in those areas. Then the other area is about measuring this kind of fast stuff. So remember we were talking about, sort of close stuff, near stuff, and fast stuff. The fast stuff I would term in a slightly more technical sense as being your macro environment. So this is measuring stuff that's outside of your direct control, but that can have an impact on you. So you're looking for some of the big trends, figuring out a way of just keeping your finger on the pulse, using data and insights and intelligence here to watch out for those bigger trends. I mean, a couple of trends that are clearly impacting us all, we can't necessarily affect them directly, but they are going to have an impact on us, are the use of mobility. In other words, there is still this huge growing trend of smartphone access to us from a digital sense. So we need to kind of figure out how's that going to impact and play out in the kind of content, the kind of channels that we use. So mobile access is a really key one. Another one is AI, and it's starting to impact on us in terms of efficiencies. It's not something we're going to cover specifically in this session, but it's about understanding how can technology enable you and your customer to become, just more efficient in that conversation going forward, because that is coming. It's here for a number of organizations. And if you think it's something that's a bit futuristic, well, it isn't, because it's actually playing out in some industries right now. Another thing as well to watch out for, and this is a really important one, are what we might term social mentions. In other words, mentions and conversations and comments that are happening outside of your micro environment. In other words, the connections that you already have. If there's a conversation going on that might involve you, in other words, people are commenting on your brand, they're commenting on your campaign or your products or services, or they're reviewing you, but they're not people or organizations that you're directly connected with, but they could still be super important to the impact that they're having actually on your brand perception and your brand quality at some distance. And of course, if you're not listening to this macro wider environment, then you're going to miss out on those. And you're going to assume, sat there in your little bubble, you're going to assume that everything that you can see, because you're connected to all these people, is the reality. Whereas, of course, there is this wider reality in a global sense of people talking about you and your brands and your organization that is actually probably not immediately obvious to you. But as a marketer and as a communicator or as a business owner, you've got to keep your finger on that pulse as well. Because if you don't, then there could be adverse activity that's happening, which is impacting you, and you're not even aware of it. So these are three really important levels of things that you can measure using analytics. It's the close stuff, the stuff that you can really control, your website as an example, that near stuff, so that's kind of your social networks, and then this fast stuff, the macro stuff, the big trends that you're ultimately looking for. But irrespective of those three, and irrespective of the way that you kind of, blend those together to get a really nice feel for the kinds of stuff that you want to measure going forward, the ultimate question is, what is your conversion point? In other words, can you, as a result of the things that you're measuring, get more people who become aware of you to convert, in other words, to have that faith and trust in you that you are worth buying into, either as a product or service that you're selling or as a brand that you're trying to become influential by? How many people can you get as a percentage or as an absolute number through that point of conversion? Because that is ultimately the proof of the pudding. That is ultimately the test that you're trying to set up here, is getting people who are aware of you to convert into being customers in the way that is most relevant for you to define them. So ultimately your analytics is looking to give you that information. And then of course beyond that, if we know customer journey and visitor flow really well now, ultimately it's then how many of those can you use digital analytics to ensure that you're actually retaining, and what kind of engagements and conversations, what kind of advocacy can you show is actually happening. So ultimately, it is that conversion point that's super, super important here. So even though you might be measuring a lot of stuff, ultimately it is this endpoint ROI that you're looking for. And en route to that, it is pretty much that conversion point. Can you show evidence of the number of people who become aware of you, who then convert, and then you can establish a really great lifetime value with, because ultimately that's really what you're after here. Okay, so having then established those are the kinds of things that you can be measuring, now you've got to start to think about what kind of tools are available to enable you to measure the close stuff, the near stuff, and the far stuff. So let's begin with the close stuff, because this is the stuff that's much closer to home and probably easier to kind of sort of control and start with. Now, when it comes to close stuff, we're using the website as an example. So most of us have got a website. For most of us, Google Analytics will be probably, if not, you're using sort of other tools, but this probably will be the most efficient means of measuring, at least getting a starting sort of frame of reference for starting to measure the effectiveness of your website. So when you go and log into Google Analytics, one of the first things that you'll see, because it generally pops up if you're going in for sort of an early visit to this, it will pop up with some real-time views as to how many people are actually right now active on your website. Now, of course, this has the big wow factor because you think, whoa, here's some analytics that, is really close to home because it's looking and it's shaping up, actually what's happening in the big world, because, these are real people who are actually looking at my website, looking at active pages, and I can see where they're coming from. I can see actually which countries or which regions they're in right here, right now. So, of course, there is a big kind of wow factor to that. And this is the starting point that is the first kind of almost test of your resilience in terms of focusing on ROI. Now, if you are an e-commerce site and if you are looking at immediate short-term campaigns selling product or services, and you want to know as a result of a little tweet that you just did the absolute impact in an immediate sense, and I mean right here, right now, in real time, of that particular piece of content, and you're tracking that all the way through to see if you can get sales, then real-time analytics, watching your website like this is a great thing to do. And it really is, power in the palm of your hand, literally. For most of us, we don't operate on a real-time basis. For most of us, some slightly historic data is far more useful. So don't get swayed by the excitement of looking at real-time data if it's not relevant to you. If it is, because there is this urgency of sales in terms of the activity you're doing, then that's a great thing to do. And the tool is there. It's real-time analytics in Google Analytics. But of course, it's very easy to get kind of swept away by that as being something important, even if it's not. So this is the first test of using something like Google Analytics, which is actually going into it with a very specific set of questions. And remember this reverse engineering, it's not going into it looking and saying, wow, what can it tell me? Because of course it can tell you a billion combinations of data and instantly you can get put off. So the trick with this is to go into it looking at, can I answer the questions with which I entered Google Analytics front door? And that's the key thing. Get passionate and obsessed with the questions you want to ask of it. And of course, those questions often come back to, okay, I did some activity on a particular day. How did that then impact on the number of people coming through, what they did, how long they spent on that site on that particular day as a result of that campaign or that activity in social media, how long did they spend, what kind of other pages did they follow as a result of doing that, how many new people did I attract as a result of that activity. This is all stuff that you can look at historically. And by historically, I mean not in real time. So that probably for most of us is more relevant data that's actually going to ask some pretty sort of sensible questions it's going to actually answer, rather than just getting wooed by the the excitement of that real-time approach. For a lot of us as well, we're doing activity in social media that we want to see if there's a real time, or a real time, but a real effect and a real kind of value too. So then we can start looking at the social value, if you like, of that activity. So another nice thing that we see from Google Analytics is the amount of traffic and actually what happened as a result of incoming visitors via clicking a link from our social networks. And we can see a breakdown really nice and neatly and precisely from individual social networks. And then of course, because we can timestamp this and because we can look on particular days, we can associate these numbers with activity that we did. So we can start to learn, did campaign A or did activity or did piece of content A perform better than activity or piece of content B? And we can start to then make those like-for-like comparisons. And of course, that's far more important than just looking at those big numbers. We're looking at 9,625 sessions. Wow, that's a much bigger number than last month. Didn't we do well? Well, of course, you only did well if those sessions actually resulted in some kind of conversion, some kind of activity that really means something to the organization. So that's where we have to kind of constantly, and it really is a constant thing, not to be swayed by the glamour of the big numbers, not to be swayed by the vanity, and to keep ourselves on track, answering the questions that we're coming into to answer. Now, one of the things that's really, really good about Google Analytics is that over recent years, with something called visitor flow, and you might see it as behavior flow, but visitor flow, is that Google has, in its wisdom, started to align some of its analytics with the kind of customer journey plotting that marketers are now doing. So what we can see is that based on a landing page, based on a specific geography, based on a particular campaign, you can then start to see the flow of people actually traveling through your website, which of course is your customer flow or your visitor flow that you've plotted out, and see how that plotting actually matches the real world experience that people have had as they've come through your site. So here we're seeing a kind of a like for like, that Google Analytics visitor flow, which you can find in the left-hand column of the options that you have of all the reports that Google Analytics presents to you. You can see visitor flow, which will then equate, hopefully, pretty closely with the customer journey that you plotted in advance. All those clicks that you've enabled people to follow as they sort of travel through your website to get to an ultimate destination. And of course, the really nice thing with visitor flow is that it will show you where people are dropping off. And this is a really important thing because it can allow you as analytics to show you exactly where people, didn't do what you expected or wanted them to do. Then, of course, you can then go back and take corrective action. So you can provide something that's a little more obvious to them. So you can provide that little button, maybe a little bit higher up the page or in a slightly different position. You can do a different test of maybe a certain image or maybe a phrase or maybe a title to enable people to more accurately and easily flow through their journey. And of course, hopefully, as you then monitor next month, and of course, within something like Google Analytics, you can do this month versus last month, or this quarter versus last quarter, or some custom dates versus some custom dates. So you can do those like-for-like comparisons and see if those improvements that you've been planning have actually taken place in the real world. So it's hugely powerful at that kind of visitor flow level. And certainly there are other things that you can do once you get down to that level of detail. One that I particularly like is the ability to be able to look at hotspots on particular pages. And this really works well if you have specific landing pages that you're using for a campaign. So something like Hotjar and many other services are available that allow you to do this, allow you to see color-coded hotspots, either from a particular click area, so you can compare where you're positioning your buttons on the landing page to enable that flow through on that page to the next point in the customer's journey. Or if you have landing pages or little microsites, you can then look at, particularly if you've got pages which are now very much in fashion on a mobile device, for example, where the page is vertically very, very long, and what you're reliant on is getting people to actually travel down a page to view lots of different content. What these kinds of hotspot services like Hotjar allow you to do is to see how far people actually traveled down that particular page. So at the top of the page where things are all red, you've probably got 100% of people saw that who landed on that page. As they travel down the page, the colors change and give you a really nice kind of intuitive feel of how far people were willing to go. Now, of course, if in the darker colors at the bottom of the page, you can see, well, that was where our call to action was, because we expected people to read all this content, travel down the page, they got to the bottom of the page and there was our lovely button. But you can see from the color coding that actually only 25% of people who landed on the page got that far down the page. Then it's a really nice check and balance that really encourages you to put that call to action maybe a lot higher up the page. And maybe it's one of the early things, or at least you put kind of multiple calls to action to move away from that page to the next point in the journey. So you're giving choice, but what you're doing is you're basing it on evidence. And of course, the ultimate flow through at this close stuff is to get people flowing through on the customer journey and trying to improve that percentage of people who drop off at each step in the journey. And ultimately, that's our role in marketing is to literally, and I often use the phrase, handhold people through the journey. But of course, we can think we're doing that, but if we're not using analytics effectively to learn where we can make improvements, then we're only doing kind of half of the job. Then what we're probably likely to be thinking about is, okay, maybe we've got some kind of mastery over kind of the website and that's that close stuff. Now let's look slightly sort of more broadly, and let's look slightly out in terms of, well, actually, where did the people come from who arrived at our website? And of course, a lot of the time it's going to be through social media. Now there are many, many insight platforms and services that allow you to monitor and measure your social media activity. So from a micro level, you know, there are lots of choices available to you. My personal favorite, I'm not sponsored by them in any shape or form, but my personal favorite, just because of some of the information that they present to me in a really kind of easily to digest form, is Social Report, socialreport.com. Really kind of like the way that they present to me on a sort of a comparative basis, how the different social networks that I use are performing against each other. And a lot of this is in a very visual format, so I can see engagement and activity, new connections, and actually what happens with them. I can see activity that actually flows through in terms of, you know, not only activity, but also engagement based on days of the week. And for me, days of the week, based on the particular channels or the particular social networks, is a really important way of me fine-tuning my activity. You know, unless you have ultimate time available, and for most of us, you know, we're all pretty busy doing stuff in our organizations, we want to make sure that we're posting and engaging at the right time, the right day of the week, and the right time of the day. Something like Social Report gives me a lovely graphical view of how each of my social networks, not just generic social activity, but each of the social networks individually is performing. So I know, for example, over the last week or so, that the afternoon, or sort of around about lunchtime into the early afternoon, is the time that I'm going to get best interaction and engagement using Instagram. And I know that later in the week is also better performing. So for me, to get best engagement on Instagram account. I also know that if I'm going to be using LinkedIn is more of a morning thing, and it's more of a morning thing at the start and end of the week. So I know particularly on a Friday morning, that's when I'm going to get the best interaction on LinkedIn. So what it allows me to do, and again, I'm looking at trends here, because, you know, things like Social Report allow you to put in specific time slots. So it allows you to be able to sort of measure this, not just over the last week or so, but I could look at this over the last quarter. So I can see aggregated information and data. And then if I need to drill down into a particular time slot, I can see what happened. I can look on particular days and say, hey, you know, I did that particular post and I put it into LinkedIn and Facebook. What were the differences? What was the sentiment? What kind of comments did I get? What kind of interactivity? And then, of course, really importantly, aligning that with the close stuff, so the Google Analytics, then what importantly happened is those people, just a few of those people who interacted with me in social, clicked on the link to come to my website, how did they then interact? And did they go through to the point of conversion? Because ultimately that's what you're looking for. It's not just about making noise in social media and saying, hey, I've made loads of noise and I know when the noise created the most activity. It's about following that chain of engagement, that chain of action and encounters all the way through the process. So it's about joining this micro stuff up with the close stuff. That's really, really important. And then as we look even more broadly, it's about engaging with what we call the macro stuff. And so for social monitoring, again, there are lots of, these have been in use by sort of PR people for many, many years, because this gives them a really, really good handle and grasp on this wider world. And if you're managing the reputation of your brand, if you're looking at how did my campaign activity impact the world, you know, on a broader level, rather than just through people I was connected with. One sort of channel I'm playing with at the moment, which is quite nice because they send direct alerts, and you can specify how often you want to get those alerts in real time, daily, weekly, or just on a customized frequency. What I'm playing with at the moment is Talkwalker. That's talkwalker.com, TALK walker.com. And they're, as they claim, you know, your extra set of eyes and ears. So they allow you to create these little dashboards and these little alerts that will come through to you in a manner that you want, so that you can keep your finger on the pulse. And this is beyond that obvious sort of micro or close environment that is obviously a lot more easy to connect with and easier to monitor. So by encountering all three of those and deciding which kind of sets of tools that you're looking to work with, it's then about creating a relevant kind of dashboard of reporting for yourself. Now, some people like to report via things like spreadsheets. I'm a much bigger advocate of something a bit more visual. So what I would be doing is I would be taking in the answers to those questions and thinking, could I present some graphs? Could I present some pie charts? Could I present something a little bit more visual that presents to either my clients or to an organization that, this is a trend. This is something that we need to be taking account of. And at times I could be listening to the level of a tweet and saying, look, this tweet had this impact. Or I could be taking a few steps back and saying, look, I've been monitoring this trend and this is how I see it impacting us in the short term, in the medium term, and in the longer term. So one of the key things here is about constantly asking, irrespective of your questions and irrespective of what you actually get back as data from these three levels of interaction with your analytics, it's constantly asking the question, and this means that, and then waiting for the answer. So what you're doing is you're turning the information into intelligence. And by that, I mean turning the data that you see into something that allows you then to do something with it. In other words, the intelligence is your interpretation of that data in terms of the value it's going to add to the business. So this hopefully will be the last time you'll report back to the organization a set of numbers. What you should be reporting back to your organization, or to you if you're the business owner, is what do these numbers actually mean? In other words, interpreting those numbers by saying, and this means that this, and this means that that. So it's not about just taking the numbers, and by kind of sort of looking at it in this way, what I would encourage you to do is to kill your automation. Now, what I mean by that is a lot of marketers, a lot of people who report on digital analytics rely on automated reports to just churn out month after month data and numbers and kind of sort of ineffectual graphs that nobody reads, that gather dust on the shelf or in an inbox. Everybody just puts them into the spam. Nobody's really interacting with them. And that's a key problem with data and analytics. And the problem is because what you haven't done, if you do get that reaction, is you haven't done the interpretation. So it is about the who, how, what, when, why, and where. And it's about the interpretation of the numbers that answer those questions, that allow you to play back to that ROI story that you're trying to tell. So it starts with the ROI, it plays back from the ROI, if you can figure out the real ROI to the organization, and then use the numbers to help to weave and tell a story. Present that story visually, probably, maybe with some evidence kind of sort of back up if certain individuals in certain parts of the organization like the numbers, and in lots of ways kind of learn the language of the people you're going to be serving here and the people who you're going to be reporting to, and serve them back a dashboard or a set of graphs or a set of information and pie charts, nice visual stuff that shares trends, that shows that you're providing evidence of behavioral change, customer change, ways that you can make constant improvements to the processes that you have, ways that you show that you're monitoring those things at a local, micro and macro level. And at that point, then you're starting to tell a story that the organization can not only understand, but that can actually adapt to as well. So those would be the three things that I would say are your next steps. Once you figure out the tools that are going to help you answer the questions, that are going to help you to deliver that ROI that you're plotting, and those are the three stages of doing it, then it's about turning the information that you find into intelligence to advise the organization so that it can figure out the real ROI and continuous improvement and serve it to them in a language that they can understand. And if you do those three things, then what you're doing is you're avoiding this constant narrative of here's some more numbers. And of course, those numbers nobody really gets, probably including us. We don't really understand what we're looking at. So it strips away all of that noise. It strips away the stuff that actually isn't adding any value. And it turns this big data opportunity into intelligence that drives your organization forward into 2020 with continuous improvement and there beyond. So that's kind of what I'd expect. So that's me done. That's my kind of sort of starting point to hopefully answer sort of a kind of a set of ways really that you can start to get a structure, if you like, for your thinking as to how to use this. So it's Google Analytics for your sort of starting point, something like Hotjar to kind of give you that more granular level of kind of what's happening, so you can start to make little sort of incremental changes. It's something like Social Report or Sprout Social. Others are available to monitor your social insights. And then something like TalkWalker to do that kind of social listening on a broader basis. And those will be the three kind of starting points to be able to enable you to take those 3 steps of information into intelligence to tell the ROI story in the language of the people that you're trying to influence. So I think we'll step now into Q&A. So it's not going to be all about sort of me and telling the story, because I'd like to kind of find out a little bit what you'll be thinking, and any sort of ideas that you have or any questions that you'd like me to answer. So use either the chat facility if you're watching this live, or the message thread facility below if you're watching this on catch up, and ask away. So first question I've had come through as a direct message here is how can I look at competitor websites? Right, well, that's a really interesting one, because I did mention competitors in that micro environment. The one service that I use, which is a free one, it is limited to the number of times you can do it, but it is also a really good one in terms of monitoring competitor website activity. And you can actually do it for your own website as well. Is something called Nibbler. So that's Nibbler, nibbler.silktide.com. So nibbler.silktide.com. And you literally just put in your web address or the web address of the competitor, and it will give you some numerical scores as to how your website performs, how socially connected it is, some of the improvements that it would suggest in terms of improvements to both the technology, the format, the layout, but also things that it will look to improve in terms of the content that you've got on there. So it is pretty accurate, to be honest. And I would suggest probably doing it for yourself first, so that you can get a nice little heads up on how an objective third-party service is looking at your site and giving you some feedback, and also then put in some of your competitors and see how they perform. It could also be a very useful exercise to go through prior to creating a website or a campaign brief for an agency. So if you use agencies, for them, they'll probably have their own sort of facilities for testing out your website if they're looking to redevelop it for you. But this can be a nice way of actually creating a brief, because what it'll do is it'll help to give you an insight into some of the areas that maybe sort of do need attention when you look at that new version of your site. So yeah, nibbler.silktide.com is a good one. Another question that's just come through, I think sort of following on from the later slides here, which is how is it best to present the analytics back to my business? Well, as I said, it was certainly for me, it's quite nice to do visual stuff. People really engage emotionally with visual things. Unless you are very financially or numerically driven, probably a visual way forward is a nice way of doing things. So visuals that show trends is very good. So before and after graphs can be a sort of really good one. I would say anything that you do, see if you can play it back sort of visually against the ROI focus, because particularly if you're presenting to a business decision maker, your line manager or management team, if you can present something back that's based around the ROI story, because of course that's their top priority. So rather than talking kind of marketing speak, if you can present your analytics back in terms of a really close link with the ROI, because that's probably the top thing on their agenda. So then of course then you're talking their language. And if you want to put it into the context of a wider sort of business piece, in other words, you're contributing your analytics into maybe a broader report. So maybe you're tasked with presenting data back in terms of like a monthly report for the board, that it considers broader things in terms of your marketing communication. I always think that the balanced scorecard, and you can Google it if you haven't come across that balanced scorecard. If you do that in Google, so search balanced scorecard and then click on images, you'll get a whole bunch of different templates and images that show you some just nice ways of including the balanced scorecard as a sort of reporting process. And for me, it's a really nice one to integrate lots of these analytics into a broader kind of business piece. Because a lot of the time, if you're reporting digital analytics back in terms of it being very sort of just marketing centric, then it can often miss the value. Whereas if you put the marketing and analytics and stuff into a visual report that shows how it's aligned with the broader organizational value and the broader organizational challenges, then it kind of puts marketing at a strategic level, rather than it being sort of typically sort of held down its little sort of tactical rabbit hole. So I think the more you can put it into that kind of strategic, higher business sort of level, the better. So probably, balanced scorecard would probably be a really good one on that one. Another question I've just had through is, how do I find my KPIs? Oh, that's an interesting one. We've not really talked about KPIs here. So KPI, key performance indicator. Now, so depending on how you interpret that for your organization, a KPI is basically, as the name implies, it's a performance indicator. So it's like a little flag that is something that you probably would have front of mind as you try to create your questions, as you try to show the ROI piece and the evidence that you're going to play back against those. So for me, when you start to do this, if you were to do this with like an open kind of sort of brainstorming activity, and you just think, okay, let's just download all of the possible things that would answer those questions, probably what you'll find is that you have too many things to monitor. So often a starting point for me when it comes to prioritizing, okay, which things am I going to do first, or which things am I going to put in as KPIs, would be to ask the really, really simple single question. And this is a really tough one to get the answer for, but if you can do it, then it should give you a lot of clarity. So the question would be, if I could only measure one thing in the coming month, what would it be? Okay. So that's a really clear question. You're only allowed as a marketer or as a business owner to develop, but to ask one question in the next month. What would it be? So you're not allowed to do lots, just one question. And again, of course, that's always back to the ROI piece. Whatever your answer is, that's probably your most important KPI. And then once you've answered that, take that one out of the list and then answer the same thing again. Okay, of the remaining things that I could have as indicators, as questions answered, what would the next most important one be for the next month? What would that one be? Of course, there's your second one. And so keep doing that down to the level of the number of things that you physically have time to monitor. So, that would be the way I would say to both get your KPIs, because those really are these questions that you want answered, but also to prioritize them, because I think for most of us, there are so many things we could measure and monitor. What we need to make sure that we're doing is actually doing the ones that are really going to make the biggest difference. But going back to that reverse engineering thing, I think that's a really important thing. Once you've got that in mind, everything plays back to that ultimately. So another question I just had come through is, how long would you say it should or can take to interpret the analytics effectively? Oh, lovely question. Probably the honest answer is way too long. But then it's also the right answer. It's as much time as you have available. I mean, certainly when I define what marketing is, I always suggest that as far as you possibly can, it's about striking the balance between listening and talking. Okay, so if we take that through to the nth degree, the ultimate balance should probably be 50% listening, 50% talking. In other words, the 50% talking is the publishing, the promotion, the noise, the campaigns, the content, the everything else. And then 50% should be about listening. In other words, watching what happens when you do that stuff, because then you can make much better effect of that stuff the next time you do it. Now, of course, for most of us, we feel pressured in by our bosses, by our client, whoever it happens to be, we feel pressured into doing more stuff. But if you can try wherever you can to spend, a better balance, if you like, of listening, and that's what I would say about the interpretation of your analytics, spend the longest possible time as you can physically afford doing the listening versus doing the talking, then I think you're going to see, far greater returns, far better focus and alignment with the ROI you're after, and far better detail, if you like, at that kind of really granular level. Now, of course, you could say, well, I've only got time to do it once a month. But okay, well, that's the once a month, the big picture stuff, those big trends that I was saying about best time of day, best day of the week. What we're talking about here, and I think what this question really adheres to, is this thing about, should I be listening down to the level of each piece of individual content I publish? And the answer is absolutely categorically yes. Even if you get to a point of doing it 80-20, in other words, if it took you 80% of your time to create that lovely tweet or that lovely Instagram image or that really, really good blog, 20% of the time that you would have spent, if you say you've got 100% time available to do this thing, 80% is about the creation, and then 20% is the bit where actually you were doing the measurement and the listening to what happened as a result of it. If you're not doing that bit, then you're really missing a trick, because you haven't really learned what was the best bit about it and what would you improve next time. So I think at absolute worst, it's 80-20. In a perfect world, aim for 50-50, because if you can get it to that level, then your quality score is just going to go through the roof. So I think that's probably a lovely way of kind of answering that question. It's in the ideal world, it's 50-50. In reality, it's probably 80-20. So thank you very much for those questions. Those are really, really good questions. And if you do have any other questions, if you're sort of thinking about this and you find sort of having put this into place, you want to then kind of test and bounce a few ideas around, obviously watch again on Catch Up. We'll post some thread sort of questions there, and I shall do my best, very best to answer those questions. So thank you very much for joining this particular session. I hope you found it useful in terms of getting a structure and a framework for creating some hopefully better value from your digital analytics, and also, of course, the really important element of reporting that back, both to yourself but also to your organization. So stay in touch, keep in touch with how this actually works and plays out for you, and I shall see you hopefully on a new webinar in the not too distant future. Thanks again for coming, and I'll speak to you again very soon.